Hello, and welcome to History at Night. Tonight, we are going to travel together to a city unlike any other that has ever existed on this earth. A city that stood at the very edge of two worlds, balanced on a narrow tongue of land where the waters of Europe and Asia kissed in the night. A city that was conquered and reborn, not once, not twice, but 3 times. A city so magnificent, so layered in gold and grief and glory, that even now, more than 5 centuries after its final fall, its very name carries the weight of lost empires. We are going to Constantinople, and we are going to take our time. This is a story for the quiet hours. For the moment when the day has finally released you, when the ceiling above you is soft in the darkness and your body is beginning to remember how to be still, I am going to tell you everything, not just the famous moments, not just the battles and the fires and the fall. I am going to tell you about the city itself, about the smell of its harbours in the early morning, about the sound of its bells rolling across 7 hills, about the emperors who were blinded and exiled and murdered in their own throne rooms, about the women who ruled it in secret, about the scholars who carried its books out through the siege gates on the last night and changed the world forever. This is a long story. It deserves to be told slowly. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, in the dark, in the quiet. These videos take a long time to put together, and knowing that someone out there is listening, somewhere in the world, in a bed or on a couch, or maybe sitting by a window watching the rain, that means everything to me. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it now. Close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing slow, and let us begin. Before there was Constantinople, there was Byzantium, not the empire, the city. A small, ancient Greek settlement perched on a triangular headland where the Bosphorus Strait narrowed to its most dramatic point. The Greeks who founded it, around 657 BC, were settlers from the city of Megara, led by a man whose name has been given to history as Byzas. The story goes that Byzas consulted the oracle at Delphi before choosing where to plant his colony, and the oracle told him to settle opposite the city of the blind. He sailed the Aegean and the Propontis, and when he came to the strait where the waters of the Black Sea poured southward into the Marmara, he saw on the Asian shore a small settlement already established. He looked across the water. He saw the headland on the European side, and he understood the settlers on the Asian shore had been blind. They had chosen comfort over strategy. They had built beside a gentle bay when they could have stood on the greatest natural fortress in the ancient world. Byzas chose the headland. He built his city on a hill above the Golden Horn, a narrow inlet of water that curved into the European shore like a crooked finger of gold. The harbour it formed was one of the safest and most sheltered on the entire coast. Merchant ships from the Black Sea had to pass through the strait to reach the Mediterranean. Every one of them passed Byzantium. The city became, from its very first generation, a city of tolls and trade. It grew slowly at first. It was a Greek city like many others, with its agora and its temples and its walls of cut stone. It was sacked by the Persians. It was besieged by the Spartans. It submitted to Alexander the Great, and then to the Romans after him. Absorbed quietly into the vast machinery of the Roman Empire, a useful port on the edge of the known world. For centuries, it was simply a provincial city. Important, yes. Beautiful, yes. But not yet exceptional. Not yet the center of anything larger than itself. That changed because of one man's dream, and that man's name was Constantine. Constantine was not supposed to become emperor. He was the son of a soldier named Constantius, who had risen through the brutal hierarchy of the late Roman military to become one of 4 co-emperors in a system the Romans called the Tetrarchy. The idea behind the Tetrarchy was elegant in theory. 4 men would share the empire, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each responsible for a quarter of the vast Roman world. In practice, it was a system built on ambition and mutual distrust, and it collapsed almost immediately after Constantius died in the northern city of York in the year 306. Constantine was with his father when he died, The soldiers, men who had served under Constantius for years and who trusted his son, declared Constantine emperor on the spot. It was an act of loyalty, but also of defiance. Because the Tetrarchy had not chosen him, the other emperors did not recognize him. And so began a long and grinding series of civil wars that would eventually leave Constantine as the sole ruler of the entire Roman world. The decisive moment came in the year 312, at a place called the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome, where Constantine faced an army led by his rival Maxentius. According to the story that Constantine himself told later, something happened to him the night before the battle. He saw a vision. In the sky above him, blazing in light, he saw a symbol, the key rho, the first two Greek letters of the name of Christ, and with it, words he would never forget. In this sign, conquer, Constantine ordered the symbol painted on his soldiers' shields. The next day, he won. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber when the bridge he was retreating across collapsed. Constantine rode into Rome as its master, and he believed, with every fibre of his being, that the Christian God had given him the victory. What followed was not an immediate conversion of the empire, but something slower and more consequential. Constantine became a protector and then a promoter of Christianity, at a time when Christians were still a minority in the Roman world. Still fresh from the memory of the great persecutions under Diocletian, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted tolerance to all religions. He began building churches with imperial funds. He presided over the Council of Nicaea, trying to settle the fierce theological debates tearing the church apart. He changed the empire's relationship with Christianity forever. But all of that is the wider history. What matters to our story is what Constantine did with his eyes fixed east. He was a man who thought in empires, and the empire he had inherited was enormous, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Nile. But its center of gravity had been shifting east for a century. The old city of Rome was no longer the true heart of the Roman world. The emperor needed to be near the Danube, near the Persian frontier, near the trade routes of the east. He needed a new city, a city he could build from his own imagination, a city that would be the capital of a Christian empire. He looked at several locations. He considered Troy, that ancient city of myth. He considered Chalcedon on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus. And then he looked across the water at the small Greek city on its triangular headland, and he understood what Byzas had understood 700 years before. This was the place. In the year 324, Constantine began his transformation of Byzantium. He did not renovate it. He reimagined it. He expanded its walls to enclose a far larger area, taking in all 7 hills of the headland. He imported marble from the quarries of the east. He brought sculptures and monuments from the ancient cities of Greece and Egypt, stripping their forums and temples to decorate his new capital. He built a forum named after himself, centered on a great column of porphyry marble topped with a statue of himself as the sun god, the rays of a crown blazing from his head. Because even as a Christian emperor, Constantine understood the language of divine power. He built a hippodrome, larger than any in the Western world, a track for chariot racing that could hold 100,000 spectators. He decorated its spina, the central dividing barrier, with the bronze serpent column from Delphi, a monument that had stood since the Persian Wars, and with an Egyptian obelisk that was old when Rome was young. He built a palace complex beside the hippodrome that would grow over the centuries into a labyrinth of halls and gardens and churches and prisons and treasuries, a city within a city. On the 11th of May, in the year 330, Constantine formally dedicated his new capital. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, but that name never stuck. The people called it by the name they have always called it in Greek, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine, Constantinople. For the first decades after its founding, Constantinople grew with the frantic energy of a city that knows it is destined for greatness. Populations poured in from across the empire. Constantine offered free grain to citizens of the new capital, a policy that had the intended effect of pulling families away from old Rome and toward the new center of power. Artisans came, merchants came, soldiers came, priests came, drawn by the new Christian emperor's obvious favor. The city, that had been a comfortable provincial Greek town, suddenly found itself filling up with languages and ambitions from every corner of the known world. But the empire Constantine had unified did not stay unified for long. After his death in 337, it fractured again along the fault lines that would eventually become permanent. His three sons divided it among themselves and spent the next years killing each other for a larger share. The western half, centered on the old Roman heartland, began its long, slow decline. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, grew stronger. This is the beginning of what historians would eventually call the Byzantine Empire, though the people who lived in it never called it that. To them, they were Romans. They spoke Greek because Greek had been the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, but their identity was Roman. Their emperor was the Roman emperor, and their capital was the rightful center of the Roman world. The split between East and West was not, in their eyes, the creation of two separate empires. It was merely a delegation of authority. Constantinople was Rome. Constantinople was always Rome. The first great crisis of the new capital came not from an external enemy, but from an internal one. The ferocious theological disputes that Constantine had hoped to settle at Nicaea, but had only driven underground. The central question, the one that split the Christian world for a century, concerned the nature of Jesus Christ. Was he truly divine, co-equal and co-eternal with God the Father? Or was he a created being, lesser than the Father, the Son of God, but not God himself? The position that Christ was fully divine and equal to the Father was called Nicene Christianity, later simply Orthodox Christianity. The position that Christ was subordinate to the Father was called Arianism, after a priest named Arius from Alexandria, who had articulated it with particular force. The emperors vacillated. Some supported the Nicene position. Others, enchanted by the theological elegance of Arianism, swung the other way. Bishops were exiled and recalled and exiled again. Councils met and produced creeds that were immediately disputed. The streets of Constantinople were sometimes literally dangerous for those who held the wrong position. A bishop arriving to take his post in the capital might be attacked by a mob of citizens defending the opposing theology. The debate raged for most of the 4th century. It was finally settled, at least for the Eastern Empire, by an emperor named Theodosius, who in 380 issued an edict declaring that all Roman citizens must hold the Nicene faith. Arianism was heresy. The Council of Constantinople in 381 confirmed this. The Church of the Eastern Empire had its doctrine, and then, 20 years later, Theodosius made the decision that would shape the next 1,000 years. He divided the empire between his two sons. The western half, everything from Britain to the Balkans, went to his older son Honorius. The eastern half, everything from the Balkans to Egypt, went to his younger son Arcadius. The two empires drifted apart almost immediately. The west fell to the Germanic migrations, as the Visigoths and Vandals and Huns swept across its provinces. Rome itself was sacked in 410, an event that shocked the Mediterranean world to its foundations. The Western Empire staggered on for another half-century, a hollow shell of what it had been, before the last Western emperor. A boy named Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476 by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who did not even bother to proclaim himself Emperor of the West. He simply sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople. There was, he implied, only one emperor now, the emperor in Constantinople. In the 5th century, Constantinople was growing into the largest city in the Western world. The walls that Constantine had built were already being outpaced by the expansion of the city beyond them. In the years between 408 and 413, during the reign of the child emperor Theodosius II, a new circuit of walls was constructed under the supervision of a man named Anthemius, who served as regent for the young emperor. These were the Theodosian walls, and they would stand for the next 1,000 years. They were not simply impressive, they were staggering. A triple line of defense, an outer wall, a second main wall rising behind it, and a towering inner wall whose towers rose nearly 60 feet above the surrounding plain. Between the walls were terraced platforms from which defenders could pour fire and arrows onto any besieging force. In front of the outer wall, a wide moat was dug, fed by channels from the rivers beyond the city. To take Constantinople by direct assault, an enemy would have to cross the moat under fire, breach the outer wall, fight their way to the second wall, breach that, fight through the inner ditch, and then assault the main wall with its enormous towers. No army in the world had ever done it. None would for a very long time. The city behind those walls was extraordinary. The Hippodrome remained its social heart, a place where the circus factions, the blues and the greens, were not merely sports supporters but political forces with their own networks of power and patronage. The emperors of the 5th and 6th centuries managed these factions carefully, supporting one or the other to maintain their hold on popular opinion. The chariot races were not entertainment in the way we understand entertainment today. They were a ritual of civic participation, a place where the emperor appeared before his people, where grievances were voiced, where the mood of the city could be felt in the roar of 100,000 voices. The city had its forums and its colonnaded streets, its markets where silk from China and spices from India and grain from Egypt moved through the hands of merchants speaking a dozen languages. It had its baths, though these were slowly changing in character, becoming less the great social institutions of classical Rome and more neighborhood facilities as the Christian reluctance toward public nudity gradually transformed the culture. It had its hundreds of churches, each with its particular saint and its particular feast day and its particular congregation of devoted, often fanatical worshippers. And above them all, growing year by year in size and ambition, rose the church that would become the greatest building of the medieval world, the Hagia Sophia. The original church on the site, built under Constantine, had burned. A second church, built under his son Constantius, had also burned, this time during the Great Riot of 404 that followed the exile of the Patriarch John Chrysostom, a man so beloved and so controversial that his removal from Constantinople by the Empress Eudoxia caused the city to tear itself apart. The ruins of the second church stood for a century, and then came Justinian. Justinian I was born around 482 inches, a small village in the Balkans, the nephew of a peasant soldier named Justin, who had risen through the ranks of the imperial guard to become, against all probability, Emperor of the Roman East. Justin was illiterate. He governed through the intelligence of his nephew, who had been brought to Constantinople as a young man and educated with imperial resources. When Justin died in 527, Justinian succeeded him without crisis, which was itself remarkable in a palace where succession often involved assassination. Justinian was not a physically impressive man. He was of medium height, round-faced, with a smile that contemporaries described as pleasant, but which concealed a temperament capable of extraordinary coldness. He slept very little. He worked through the night, moving from audience to audience, from document to document, driven by an appetite for governing that his courtiers found exhausting. He did not merely want to be emperor, he wanted to be the greatest emperor who had ever lived. He wanted to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient boundaries. He wanted to codify every Roman law ever written into a single ordered system. He wanted to build a church that would surpass everything that had come before it. He would, remarkably, accomplish all three of these things, and the cost would nearly destroy him. The woman beside him made everything possible and everything more complicated. Theodora was the daughter of a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome. Her father worked for the Green faction, and when he died, her mother dressed her daughters in garlands and sent them before the crowd to beg for a new position. The Greens rejected them. The Blues took pity and gave her father's job to his brother. Theodora grew up in the Blues' world, and she carried that allegiance for the rest of her life. She became an actress and a performer, which in the 6th century was not a respectable profession but something considerably more complicated and considerably lower in social standing. She was brilliant, funny, and beautiful, and she became notorious enough that her reputation reached the palaces. By the time she met Justinian, she had traveled to North Africa and back, had a daughter whose name was never recorded, and had undergone some kind of profound personal transformation, becoming a devoted Miaphysite Christian, which meant she held a different view of Christ's nature than the official theology of the empire. She had settled in Constantinople and was living quietly when Justinian fell in love with her. He wanted to marry her. His aunt, the Empress Euphemia, refused absolutely. Women of Theodora's background could not, by law, marry senators. Justinian waited until Euphemia died, changed the law, and married Theodora in 525. It was, by all accounts, a real partnership. Theodora had opinions, and she expressed them. She had a network of informants and her own correspondence with foreign rulers. She protected religious dissidents, particularly Miaphysite monks and clergy, because she shared their faith. When Justinian nearly lost everything in the great crisis of his reign, it was Theodora who held the ground beneath him. That crisis came in January of 532, and it has a name that sounds almost charming until you understand what it means: the Nika riots. Nika was what the crowd shouted at the hippodrome when a charioteer won his race. It simply meant victory, but in January of 532, it became the battle cry of a revolt that came within hours of ending Justinian's reign. The trouble began with the arrest of members of both the blue and green factions for a street brawl that had left men dead. Several were sentenced to death. 2 of them survived a botched execution and took sanctuary in a church. The city was already tense. The factions, normally rivals, began to cooperate in demanding the prisoners' release. The unrest spread. The races went on, but when Justinian refused to respond to the crowd's demands, the chanting changed. It was no longer cheers for individual charioteers. It was Nika. 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 The crowd poured out of the hippodrome. They set fire to buildings near the palace. The fires spread. For 5 days, much of the centre of Constantinople burned, including the original Senate House, the Hagia Sophia Church, and great swaths of the colonnade streets that connected the major forums. Justinian's generals could not control the situation. A rival emperor was proclaimed in the hippodrome, a senator of impeccable aristocratic lineage named Hypatius, who was himself horrified at being chosen. Justinian prepared to flee. Ships were reportedly being loaded with imperial treasure at the palace docks. His council advised him to leave while he still could. Theodora stood up. The exact words she spoke were recorded by the historian Procopius, who was present, and they have been quoted for 15 centuries since. She said that she, for her part, did not intend to flee, that the purple was a noble winding sheet, referring to the imperial purple robes, that she would not, in the time that remained to her, choose to strip herself of imperial dignity, that those who chose to flee could flee, but she would remain. Justinian remained. His generals Belisarius and Mundus led their troops into the hippodrome where Hypatius had gathered his supporters. The doors were sealed. What followed was a massacre. 30,000 people died in the hippodrome that day. Hypatius was executed. The leaders of the opposition were killed or exiled, and then Justinian rebuilt. In less than 6 years, he rebuilt the centre of Constantinople into something more magnificent than it had ever been. He widened the main street, the Messe, and lined it with new colonnades. He built a new Senate house. He rebuilt the Hagia Sophia. But the Hagia Sophia he built was not simply a replacement. It was an act of theological and imperial ambition made physical. He hired 2 extraordinary men, Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician and geometer, and Isidore of Miletus, a physicist and teacher. They were not conventional architects. They were scientists who understood the behavior of materials and forces in ways that went beyond the experience of ordinary builders. Justinian gave them 10,000 workers and essentially unlimited funds and told them to build him something the world had never seen. What they built was a dome. Not just a dome, because many buildings had domes. What they built was a dome that seemed to float. The great central dome of the Hagia Sophia rises 180 feet above the floor, and its base is pierced by 40 windows, placed so closely together that the entire lower rim of the dome appears to be made of light. When the sun moves across the sky, the quality of that light changes constantly, the dome shifting from gold to silver to a kind of luminous grey. And because it has no visible supports within the nave, because its weight is carried by half-domes and piers and buttresses arranged outside the central space, the dome appears from inside to be suspended in the air, resting on nothing but brightness. When Justinian walked into his completed church in December of 537, he is reported to have stood in silence for a long time. Then he said, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." He meant it. He was comparing himself to the builder of the great temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred building in the ancient world. He believed he had outdone it. He may have been right. The decades that followed the completion of the Hagia Sophia were the high point of what we now call the Justinianic age. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, then sailed on to Italy, where he slowly and painfully dismantled the Ostrogothic kingdom that had settled over the ruins of the Western Empire. The war in Italy lasted 20 years and destroyed the peninsula in ways it would take centuries to recover from. The great Roman senatorial families were ruined. The city of Rome itself was taken and retaken several times, its population collapsing from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands, its ancient aqueducts cut, its forums becoming grazing ground for cattle. But in the accounting of Justinian's dream, Italy was recovered. Africa was recovered. Even a corner of southern Spain was recovered. The Mediterranean was briefly, theoretically, a Roman lake again. And then everything began to contract, because even as Justinian's armies were winning in the west, the east was collapsing. The Persians under their Sasanian dynasty pressed harder and harder on the eastern frontier, requiring vast resources to hold them back. The Avars and Slavs swept down from the north, flooding into the Balkans and threatening the very approaches to Constantinople. And in 541, something arrived from the east that would kill more people than any army. The plague. It came on ships from Egypt, in the bodies of rats and fleas, and it reached Constantinople in the spring of 541. It killed between 5,000 and 10,000 people a day at its peak. Justinian himself contracted it and survived, though he was gravely ill for weeks. The city ran out of space to bury its dead. Bodies were stacked in the towers of the walls, loaded onto ships and dumped at sea, piled in the streets. The plague swept through the empire and then retreated, and then came back, and then retreated again, cycling through the Mediterranean world for the next 2 centuries, each recurrence killing thousands more, draining the population and the tax base and the military manpower that the empire desperately needed. Justinian died in 565, having ruled for 38 years. He left behind him a codified body of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, that would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe for the next 1500 years. He left behind the Hagia Sophia, which would stand for nearly 1500 years as the greatest building in the Christian world. He left behind a briefly expanded empire that would begin to shrink almost immediately after his death. He left behind a city that was magnificent and exhausted in equal measure. The next century of Byzantine history is dizzying in its violence. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Phocas, a brutal centurion, led a military revolt and had the Emperor Maurice executed along with his 5 sons, watching each boy die before his father's eyes. Phocas was then overthrown and executed by Heraclius, who arrived from North Africa, found the empire collapsing on every front, and somehow held it together through sheer force of personal will and military genius. It was Heraclius who fought the last great war against Persia, a conflict so epic that it reads like mythology. The Persians had swept across the eastern provinces, taking Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the great grain-producing provinces that fed Constantinople. The Sassanid king, Khosrow II, had even captured the true cross, the relic kept in Jerusalem that Christians believed was the very cross on which Christ had died. Heraclius counterattacked with an audacity that left everyone who witnessed it breathless. He He sailed his army around the Persian flank, landed in the Caucasus, drove deep into Persian territory, defeated army after army, and in 628 concluded a peace that restored everything the Persians had taken. The true cross came back to Jerusalem. Heraclius rode into the holy city in triumph, returning the relic with his own hands. It was the greatest military comeback in the history of the Eastern Empire. Heraclius was celebrated as a hero beyond anything his predecessors had achieved. And then, within a decade, everything he had won was gone, because while Byzantium and Persia had been destroying each other in their 30-year war, something had happened in the deserts of Arabia that neither empire had noticed in time. A man named Muhammad had received a revelation. Islam spread with a speed that defied military explanation. The Arab armies that poured out of Arabia after the Prophet's death in 632 were not fighting merely for territory, they were fighting for God. The Persian Empire, exhausted and internally fractured by the war with Heraclius, collapsed almost immediately. The Sassanid dynasty, one of the great empires of antiquity, essentially ceased to exist within 20 years. The Byzantine Empire fared better, but only better. Syria fell in 636, after the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Yarmouk, where the Byzantine army was destroyed by Arab forces in a canyon during a sandstorm. Palestine fell. Egypt fell. By 642, Alexandria, the greatest city of the East after Constantinople, was in Arab hands. The ancient library, what remained of it, its contents scattered or destroyed. The grain surplus of Egypt, which had fed Constantinople for centuries, was gone. Heraclius died in 641, his mind apparently broken by grief at what he had lost. He was, by the end, a man who had spent everything, won everything, and watched it drain away through fingers he could not close fast enough. Constantinople itself survived. The Theodosian walls held the city. The Byzantine navy, deploying a weapon called Greek fire, a burning liquid that continued to burn even on the surface of water, held the sea approaches. Arab armies besieged Constantinople in 674 and again from 717 to 718, and both times they failed. They failed because Constantinople's walls had never been broken from the outside, and because the waters of the Golden Horn were controlled by a chain that could be stretched across the harbour entrance to deny access to enemy ships. But the empire that Constantinople ruled had been cut to a fraction of its former size. This is the city in its difficult middle age, still extraordinary. Still the largest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world, at a time when Paris was a small town and London had barely recovered from its Roman origins, but smaller, poorer, more frightened than it had been in the days of Justinian and the days of Constantine. The endless frontier wars required constant resources. The plague had thinned the population. The theological disputes that had consumed the 5th century had never really been resolved, and now they returned with new ferocity. The argument this time was over images. Icons, painted portraits of Christ and the saints, had become central to Byzantine devotion. The faithful prayed before them, kissed them, carried them into battle, believed that the saint depicted was somehow present in the image itself. The churches were thick with them. The city's gates were protected by images of the Virgin Mary. Every home had its patron saint depicted on a small wooden panel. And then, in 726, the Emperor Leo III ordered them destroyed. The iconoclast controversy, the word means image breaking, tore the Byzantine world apart for the better part of a century and a half. Leo III believed, and subsequent iconoclast emperors agreed, that the veneration of icons was a form of idolatry, that it was this very practice that had caused God to punish the empire with the loss of so many provinces. The logic had its own internal consistency. If you worshipped images, you were breaking the commandment against graven images, and the disasters that had befallen the empire were divine punishment for this sin. Destroy the images, restore the pure faith, and the military situation would improve. The response from the people was volcanic. Soldiers sent to remove the large image of Christ above the Chalca Gate, the great bronze entrance to the imperial palace complex, were attacked by a mob of women and killed. The Pope in Rome condemned the policy. Monks throughout the empire refused to hand over their icons. The Patriarch of Constantinople was eventually replaced with a more compliant figure. The monasteries became the centers of resistance, and the monks who lived in them were some of the most ferocious controversialists in a society that loved nothing more than theological argument. They were beaten, they were exiled, some were mutilated, their noses cut off or their faces branded, the punishments that Byzantine law prescribed for particular crimes being applied to those whose only crime was refusing to burn a painting. The controversy produced one of the most fascinating figures in Byzantine history, Empress Irene. Irene was an Athenian woman who had been brought to Constantinople as a bride for the future emperor Leo IV. She was beautiful and politically talented, and almost certainly completely ruthless. When her husband died young, she became regent for her son Constantine VI, who was 10 years old. She was an icon worshipper. She had probably always been an icon worshipper, careful to conceal it while her iconoclast husband lived. As regent, she convened a church council in 787 at Nicaea, the same city where Constantine I had settled the Arian controversy 4 centuries before, and she reversed the iconoclast policy. Icons were restored. The monks who had been persecuted were rehabilitated. Irene was celebrated as the restorer of orthodoxy. But as Constantine grew older, the relationship between mother and son became poisonous. He resented her power. She refused to relinquish it. There were plots and counterplots. Constantine briefly had her exiled. She came back. He took sole power. She undermined him. In 797, in an act that shocked even a political culture accustomed to extreme measures, Irene had her own son arrested and blinded in the very room in the palace where he had been born. Blinding was the Byzantine alternative to execution. Kill a potential rival, and you made him a martyr. Blind him, and he could not, by the tradition that said a physical defect barred a man from ruling, ever return to power. It was more merciful than death, only in the narrowest technical sense. Constantine was blinded with such thoroughness that he died of his wounds within hours. Irene became sole empress. She was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, signing her documents with the male title Basileus, Emperor, rather than the female Basilissa. She lasted 5 years before her own ministers, exhausted by her favourites and her erratic governance, deposed her and exiled her to the island of Lesbos, where she died a year later, reportedly spinning wool to support herself. The iconoclast controversy returned under subsequent emperors before being finally resolved in 843, an event still celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy, when the Empress Theodora, another empress regent, another remarkable woman navigating the treacherous currents of Byzantine court politics, restored the icons for the last time. The monks carried their icons through the streets in procession. The people wept. The city celebrated. The icons have never been removed again. The 9th century brought a period of relative stability and even cultural flowering. The empire was smaller than it had been, but it was more coherent. The endless theological civil wars had exhausted themselves. A series of capable emperors pushed the frontiers back, recovering territory in the Balkans and even making advances in the east. Constantinople grew richer. The silk industry, which the empire monopolized, produced extraordinary wealth. The court became more elaborate in its ceremonial, more Byzantine in the original sense of the word, layered, intricate, governed by ritual and procedure. The scholar and patriarch Photius presided over a cultural revival that laid the groundwork for what historians call the Macedonian Renaissance. Ancient texts were copied and studied. Encyclopedias of classical knowledge were compiled. The palace scriptorium worked through the night, copying manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost. Much of what we know of ancient Greek literature exists because Byzantine monks and scholars of this period thought it worth preserving. It was also the age of Byzantine missionary activity. The brothers, Cyril and Methodius, working in the 9th century, devised an alphabet for the Slavic languages, the Glagolitic script that eventually became the Cyrillic alphabet that Russians and Bulgarians and Serbs still use today. They translated the liturgy into Slavic. They brought Christianity, and with it Byzantine culture, to the peoples of Eastern Europe. The Bulgaria that would trouble the empire for centuries had been converted. The Kievan Rus, that sprawling federation of Slavic and Norse peoples centered on the city of Kiev, was converted in 988 when its ruler Vladimir sent emissaries to observe the religious practices of his neighbors. They reported back that the ceremony they witnessed in the Hagia Sophia had been so beautiful that they could not tell whether they were in heaven or on earth. Vladimir chose Constantinople's Christianity over Rome's, over Islam, over Judaism. The choice rippled through history in ways that are still unfolding. But Constantinople in the 10th century was also a city of terrible violence and sudden reversals. The Macedonian dynasty that had brought stability was followed by a period in which generals and bureaucrats fought for control of the throne, with weapons that included poison, blinding, mutilation, and the monastic exile that was the Byzantine equivalent of a polite political murder. A man forced into a monastery could not, by canon law, return to secular life. It was a convenient way to remove rivals without the theological complications of killing them. And then, in the 11th century, everything changed again. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 is one of the decisive battles of world history, not because it decided the outcome of a single war, but because it opened a door that could never again be fully closed. The Seljuk Turks had emerged from Central Asia and swept across Persia and into the Arab Caliphate, with the same speed that the Arabs had once swept into the Persian Empire. They were Muslim, Sunni Muslim, and their leader, Alp Arslan, was a brilliant military commander. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes marched east with an enormous army to push back the Turkish advance. What happened at Manzikert, in eastern Anatolia, was not simply a defeat. It was a catastrophe. The Byzantine army was routed. Romanos himself was captured, a humiliation almost without precedent. He was released after negotiating a treaty. But when he returned home, he found that a coup had replaced him with a rival. He tried to reclaim the throne. He failed. He was blinded so savagely that he died of the wounds. The treaty he had negotiated, which might have stabilized the frontier, was repudiated. The Seljuks poured into Anatolia unopposed. Anatolia was the heartland of the empire, not a frontier province but the core of Byzantine military manpower, the source of its best soldiers, its most productive farmland. Within a generation, almost all of it was gone. The Turks did not destroy it, they settled it. The Greek-speaking Christian population found itself living under Turkish rule, and over the centuries, it converted and intermarried and became something new. Turkish, Anatolian, Muslim. Constantinople, sitting on its narrow peninsula, now found itself presiding over an empire that had lost its body. The city was still magnificent. The churches still gleamed. The markets still hummed. The libraries still held their treasures. But the countryside that should have fed it and the provinces that should have filled its armies were gone. The emperor who grasped this crisis most clearly was Alexios Komnenos, who took power in 1,081 inches, the usual Byzantine fashion, through a military coup. Alexios was one of the great political survivors of the medieval world. He stabilized the situation in the Balkans, buying off the Normans who had invaded from the west and the Pechenegs who pressed from the north. Using money and diplomatic skill and the occasional well-placed treachery, he reformed the currency. He brought the western frontier back under control. And for the east, he had a new idea. He would ask the Latin Christians of Western Europe for help. In 1095, his envoys appeared at the Council of Piacenza, where they presented their case to Pope Urban II. The Turks were closing in on Constantinople. Christian pilgrims could no longer safely reach the Holy Land. The Eastern Church needed the military support of its Western brothers. Urban heard them, and then he preached a sermon at Clermont that launched the First Crusade. He may not have expected what happened next. Hundreds of thousands of people from princes to peasants, sewed crosses on their shoulders, and began to march east. The First Crusade recovered Jerusalem in 1099, and the Crusaders established their own kingdom there, a strange Latin Christian implant on the eastern Mediterranean shore. Constantinople received the Crusaders with a mixture of gratitude and profound unease. These were Christians, yes, but they were Western Christians, Latin-speaking, Roman Catholic, already estranged from the Eastern Church by decades of growing theological and cultural difference. They were large, loud, and often violent, and they did not seem entirely to understand that Constantinople was not a staging post on their journey, but the center of a civilization that had been Christian for 7 centuries, while their own ancestors were still painting themselves blue. Alexios managed them. His daughter Anna Komnene watched them with the sharp eyes of a historian, and her account of the First Crusade, the Alexiad, is one of the great works of medieval literature. She describes Bohemond of Taranto, one of the Crusade's leaders, as a man whose very beauty was disturbing, a northern blonde giant who moved through the sophisticated Byzantine court with the unconscious arrogance of a man who has never doubted that the world was made for him. The relationship between Byzantium and the Crusader states was one of mutual dependency and mutual contempt that would, over the next century, curdle into something very much like hatred. And then came 1204. The Fourth Crusade began with a reasonable plan. A crusading army assembled in Venice in 1202, intending to sail to Egypt and attack the Muslim heartland from the south, a strategy that had strategic merit. But the army was short of money to pay for the Venetian ships. The Venetians, led by the blind Doge Enrico Dandolo, who was approximately 90 years old and navigated his city's politics with an animal instinct for advantage, offered a deal. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice recover the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders took Zara. They were excommunicated by the Pope for attacking a Christian city. And then they were offered another deal. A Byzantine prince named Alexios, whose father had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup, came to them with a proposal. "Help me reclaim the throne of Constantinople," he said, "and I will pay all your debts. Provision your entire army, bring the Eastern Church into union with Rome, and personally lead an army of 200,000 men on your crusade." The offer was extraordinary. It was also, as anyone who understood Byzantine politics should have known, almost certainly impossible to fulfill. But the crusade leaders, in debt and desperate, agreed. They sailed to Constantinople in the summer of 1203. The sight of the Crusader fleet appearing before the walls of the city was a shock that the Byzantine court had not prepared itself for. The current emperor, Alexios III, lost his nerve and fled the city at night, taking as much of the treasury as he could carry. The young prince was installed as Alexios IV, co-emperor with his blind, bewildered father, and then the problems began. Alexios IV could not fulfill his promises. The Eastern Church's clergy had no intention of submitting to Rome. The treasury was empty because his predecessor had emptied it. He began stripping gold from the icons and the reliquaries of churches to pay the Crusaders, which outraged the population of Constantinople. The Crusaders, frustrated and hungry, and camped outside the walls in the middle of winter, became more threatening. In January of 1204, the people of Constantinople had had enough. A riot in the city led to the murder of Alexios IV and his father, and the proclamation of a new emperor, Alexios V, who was determined to resist the Crusaders. The Crusaders decided to take the city. On the 12th of April, 1204, the Latin army breached the sea walls of Constantinople for the first time in the city's history. Once inside, they were told they could take whatever they liked for 3 days. What followed was one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in human history. The churches were stripped of their treasures. The reliquaries were opened, and their contents, centuries of carefully preserved objects considered sacred by the Orthodox faithful, were taken or destroyed. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome, 4 magnificent ancient sculptures that had stood on the spine of the track for centuries were shipped to Venice, where they still stand today, above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica. The silver was stripped from the altars. The manuscripts in the libraries were used for fuel or lost. The great bronze statues that Constantius and Justinian had brought from across the ancient world were melted down for coin. A prostitute was placed on the throne of the Patriarch of Constantinople and sang bawdy songs while the Latin soldiers cheered. The survivors of the Byzantine court fled to the provinces. Several successor states were established in the remnants of the empire: Nicaea in western Anatolia, Epirus in northwestern Greece, Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. The Latin Crusaders established their own empire in Constantinople, with a Flemish count named Baldwin as its first emperor. It was a thin and precarious thing. The Latin emperors never commanded the loyalty or the resources to hold the city as the Byzantines had held it. The population fell, trade declined. The great public works that the Byzantines had maintained were neglected. The aqueducts began to fall into disrepair. The hippodrome fell silent. For 57 years, Constantinople was a Latin city, and for 57 years, the Byzantine exiles in Nicaea looked across the water and waited. The man who brought them home was named Michael Palaiologos. He was a general of the Nicaean Empire, brilliant and unscrupulous in roughly equal measure, who maneuvered himself into the regency for the child emperor, and then, in 1258, into co-emperor status. In July of 1261, while the Latin emperor was away from the city with most of his army, a Byzantine general named Alexios Strategopoulos led a small force to the walls of Constantinople and found, through the cooperation of people inside, a small gate left unguarded. He took the city with barely a fight. The Latin emperor returned to find Constantinople back in Byzantine hands and fled on a Venetian ship. Michael Palaiologos entered the city on the 14th of August, 1261, walking through the Golden Gate on foot in humility as a pilgrim, while the clergy chanted before him. Constantinople was Byzantine again, but the Constantinople that Michael recovered was a shadow of what it had been. The population had shrunk dramatically. Great sections of the city were empty, their buildings ruined or fallen. The famous colonnaded streets were gone. Many of the ancient monuments were missing, melted or shipped to Venice or simply stolen. The hippodrome no longer held races. The harbours were quieter than they had ever been. And now there was a new threat on the horizon that no amount of diplomatic skill could negotiate away forever: the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were a dynasty of Turkish Muslim rulers who had begun in the 13th century as a small frontier principality in northwestern Anatolia, just across the water from Constantinople. They had emerged from the chaos that followed the Mongol destruction of the Seljuk Sultanate, one of dozens of small Turkish states that filled the power vacuum in Anatolia. What set them apart, in the beginning, was not military genius or particular wealth, but their position on the frontier with the shrinking Byzantine Empire, which gave them a constant source of plunder, slaves, and land. They attracted warriors, Muslim and Christian alike, who wanted to be on the winning side. The first Ottoman ruler of note was Osman, who gives the dynasty its name. His son Orhan expanded into Byzantine territory in Bithynia, capturing the important city of Bursa in 1326 and making it his capital. Nicaea fell in 1331, Nicomedia in 1337. The Byzantine cities that had served as the centers of the Nicaean exile empire fell one by one, and there was nothing the weakened Palaiologan emperors could do about it. In 1352, the Ottomans crossed into Europe. They settled in Thrace. By 1369, they had taken Adrianople, the major Byzantine city in the Balkans, and made it their own capital, renaming it Edirne. Constantinople was now surrounded. The city still held its impregnable walls and its chain across the Golden Horn, but the territory behind those walls was shrinking year by year. The Byzantine Empire, in the final century of its existence, was essentially a city-state with imperial pretensions and no army worth the name. The emperors went to the west, hat in hand, asking for help. They got promises and conditions. The Western Church demanded that the Eastern Church submit to Rome. The Pope needed to see some gesture of union before he could send forces. The councils met, and the arguments were made, and occasionally an agreement was reached, like the Union of Florence in 1439, where the Byzantine Emperor John VIII sat through months of theological debate and eventually signed a document accepting the Roman position on the matters in dispute. He went home to Constantinople with the document in his hands and found that his own clergy and his own people were furious. The great Orthodox monasteries of Greece and Mount Athos condemned the union as apostasy. The streets of Constantinople debated it bitterly. A senior Byzantine official named Lucas Notaras reportedly said that he would rather see the turban of the Sultan in the middle of Constantinople than the cardinal's hat. Whether he said exactly that is disputed. What is not disputed is that the sentiment was real and widespread. The Latin Christians were feared and despised after 1204. Many Byzantine Christians genuinely preferred Muslim rule to submission to Rome. The Islamic tradition respected Christians as people of the book, allowed them to practice their religion, maintained their churches. Latin rule had meant the stripping of those churches and the imposition of a foreign theology by force. The Western Crusade that arrived after Florence was a disaster. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, a coalition of Hungarian and Wallachian and Polish forces met the Ottoman army in Bulgaria and was annihilated. The last chance for a military rescue of Constantinople from the west died on that field. What was left was a city waiting for an end it could see coming. The man who came to end it was 21 years old. Mehmed II had come to the throne of the Ottoman Empire for the second time, having briefly reigned as a boy and been set aside in favor of his father Murad, who was recalled from retirement to deal with a crisis on the Danube frontier. When Murad died in 1451, Mehmed took power again, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI sent a congratulatory embassy, as was the custom. Mehmed received them pleasantly. He promised to honor existing treaties. He seemed, to those who met him, reasonable, even conciliatory. He was not conciliatory. He was preparing. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence, an extraordinary appetite for knowledge, reading in several languages, consulting scholars and strategists from across the Islamic and Christian worlds. He had been told all his life that Constantinople was the greatest city that had ever existed, that its walls had never been taken by storm, that the man who took it would be remembered forever. He intended to be that man. Within months of taking power, he began the preparations. He had a fortress built on the European shore of the Bosphorus, Rumeli Hisar, directly opposite an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore, so that the two between them controlled the strait and could prevent resupply from the Black Sea. He commissioned the construction of enormous cannons, of a size and weight that the world had never seen. A Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines, but found they could not pay him, designed them. The largest, according to contemporary accounts, required 60 oxen to pull and could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,000 pounds. The sound of its firing could be heard for miles. He assembled an army of somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men. Historians debate the exact numbers, but all agree it was vastly larger than anything Constantinople could field. He assembled a fleet that could control the Sea of Marmara and deny resupply from the south. In April of 1453, he appeared before the walls of Constantinople. The city that awaited him had a garrison of fewer than 7,000 men, including Genoese and Venetian volunteers who had chosen to stay when their merchant colonies were given the option of leaving. The Emperor, Constantine XI, commanded this garrison personally. He was the last Roman emperor, and he knew it. Constantine was a strange figure to carry the weight of an ending. He was not particularly brilliant. He was not particularly charismatic. He was a competent, conscientious man who had tried throughout his reign to hold together what could not be held together, who had accepted the humiliating theological union with Rome because it was the only hope for Western aid, who had watched as that aid mostly failed to materialize. He was a man doing his duty in a situation where duty could not possibly be enough. He had no wife. His first wife had died young. His second wife had also died, and he had not remarried. He faced the siege alone, in that sense, without the domestic comfort that might have softened the isolation of those weeks. The siege began on the 6th of April. The great Ottoman cannons opened fire on the Theodosian walls, and the walls, which had stood untested for 1,000 years, began to take damage. This was new. Previous sieges had failed because no technology had existed to batter down walls of that thickness and height. The cannon changed the equation. Each day, the Ottoman batteries fired, and each night, the Byzantine defenders mixed mortar and timber and debris and tried to repair the breaches before dawn. They were short of everything: men, material, time, hope. But they held for 7 weeks. The Ottomans tried to move ships into the Golden Horn by hauling them overland on greased logs, bypassing the chain, which they accomplished in late April. Now the Byzantines had to defend the seawalls of the Golden Horn as well, stretching their tiny garrison even further. Mehmed's advisors urged him to negotiate. The walls were battered but standing. The army was impatient. Disease was beginning to spread in the besieging camp. Some suggested that a generous offer to the emperor might end the siege on terms that preserved the city intact. Mehmed made the offer. Constantine refused it. He reportedly said that he was willing to give away whatever else was in his power to give, but that the city was not his to surrender, that he would rather die defending it. Whether he actually said those words, or whether they are the embellishment of later Greek writers trying to make his end as noble as possible, is impossible to know. What is certain is that he did not surrender, and what is certain is that in the last days of May, the Ottoman army was given the signal for a final, massive assault. The night of the 28th of May, 1453, was the last night of the Byzantine Empire. Constantine walked through the city. He went to the Hagia Sophia and attended the last Christian service that would ever be held there as a church, a service at which the union with Rome that he had accepted was formally observed, side by side with the traditional Orthodox rite. The two factions that had bitterly divided the city for years, praying together at the altar because there was nothing left to divide them over. The people who had argued about theology in the streets for decades knelt together in the great dome that Justinian had built beneath the floating ring of light, and they prayed. After the service, Constantine rode along the walls, saying farewell to his officers and his soldiers, thanking them for what they had done, what they were about to do. He asked for forgiveness if he had ever wronged any of them. In the early hours of the 29th of May, 1453, the Ottoman attack began. It came in waves. The first waves were of irregular troops, Bashi bazouks, non-Ottoman fighters who were there for the plunder and whose deaths were of no strategic cost to Mehmed. They threw themselves at the walls and were thrown back, and Mehmed sent more. Then came the Anatolian troops. They fought hard and gained nothing. Then, as dawn approached, came the Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman army, trained soldiers in matching uniforms who moved with a disciplined ferocity that the exhausted defenders could not match. At the critical moment, a postern gate called the Kirke Porta was found unlocked. It was a small door in the walls that had been used for sorties during the siege and had not been properly secured. The Ottomans poured through it. The defenders on the main walls, suddenly finding enemies behind them, began to break. Constantine saw the collapse. By the accounts of survivors, he tore the imperial insignia from his armor so he could not be identified, and he rode into the fighting at the breach. He was never seen again. His body was never definitively found, though the Ottomans reportedly identified a headless corpse by the purple boots it wore. The last Roman emperor died fighting on the walls of his city on the 29th of May, 1453. By mid-morning the city was Mehmed's. The Sultan entered Constantinople on horseback in the afternoon of the 29th of May. He had given his army the customary 3 days of plunder, and the taking of slaves was happening in the streets as he rode through. He went first to the Hagia Sophia, which had already been seized. The crosses and the iconostasis were being removed. He dismounted at the entrance. He picked up a handful of earth and poured it over his head, a gesture of humility before God. He walked inside. He stood in the nave and looked up at the dome. He converted it to a mosque immediately. Prayers were said. His imam climbed to the gallery and gave the call to prayer. The mosaics, the great golden images of Christ and the Virgin and the saints that covered the walls and ceiling, were mostly left in place for the time being, to be covered in plaster later. The building was too magnificent to destroy. Constantinople became Istanbul, though the change of name was gradual and the old name persisted in use for centuries. The Greek population that remained, those who had not been enslaved or fled, were given their own community under the leadership of the Patriarch, who was now appointed with Ottoman approval and was responsible to the Sultan for the behavior of the Orthodox Christian community throughout the empire. It was a form of governance that the Ottomans applied to all the non-Muslim communities within their empire, a system called the millet system, and it was, within its own terms, tolerant. Christians could worship. The Patriarchate continued. The Greek language was spoken. The Orthodox faith survived, but the Roman Empire was over. The scholars who had been working in Constantinople, copying and studying and preserving the ancient texts, scattered across Europe. Many of them went to Italy, where the Renaissance was already beginning to stir, and the manuscripts they brought with them, the works of Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides and Sophocles, fed the flames of that rebirth. The fall of Constantinople is often cited as one of the triggers of the Renaissance, and while that is probably too simple a causation, there is truth in it. The Byzantine scholars brought east to west the full inheritance of ancient Greek knowledge, and the West received it hungrily. In Venice, the bronze horses from the Hippodrome still stand. In Rome, the Vatican Library holds manuscripts copied by Byzantine scribes. In Athens, which the Ottomans also eventually controlled, the Parthenon served briefly as a mosque. In Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia stands, as it has stood for nearly 1,500 years, and its dome still seems to float in its ring of light, still the most astonishing interior space in the world. The city changed its rulers. It changed its language, mostly. It changed its religion, mostly. But the city itself, that extraordinary headland at the juncture of two seas and two continents, remains. Istanbul is one of the great cities of the 21st century, its population now in the tens of millions, its minarets rising alongside the dome of the Hagia Sophia, its markets busy with the same commerce that has moved through those narrow streets since before the Crusades, since before the Arabs, since before Justinian, since before Constantine. It fell 3 times, taken by the Crusaders in 1204, recovered in 1261, taken by the Ottomans in 1453. But cities like that do not really fall. They transform. They absorb their conquerors and teach them what it means to stand at the center of the world. Let me tell you about some of the people who lived there. Not the emperors, not the generals, the people. There was a woman who kept a bakery near the Forum of Theodosius in the 9th century. We do not know her name. We know she existed because a later chronicler mentions in passing a famous bread that was sold near that forum, a honey-glazed round loaf that travelers from the provinces came to the capital specifically to taste. She would have woken before dawn, as bakers always do, in a city that was already stirring before the light came. Constantinople never fully slept. The night watch walked the streets with their lanterns, calling the hours. The fishermen were already out on the Golden Horn. The monks, in the city's many monasteries, were already at their night offices, chanting in the darkness. She would have mixed her dough by feel in the firelight, knowing exactly how the flour behaved in the humidity of an early spring morning versus a hot summer afternoon, the way all bakers know things that can never quite be written down. She would have slid her loaves into the stone oven and listened to them bake, and when the light came through the narrow window above her kneading board, she would have carried the finished bread out to the small table in front of her shop and arranged it for the day. The street she worked on would have been busy by the time full daylight came. Constantinople in the 9th century had perhaps 500,000 people, though some estimates put it higher. They lived in a city that was built vertically as well as horizontally. in apartment buildings that rose 3 and 4 and sometimes 5 stories, in neighborhoods that were dense and complicated, where Greek and Armenian and Syrian and Jewish and Italian merchants lived within shouting distance of one another and spoke a common trade language that was Greek but flavored by all the others. She would have seen, every day of her working life, the Hagia Sophia. From almost any point in the central city, you could see it. The dome was always there. On festival days, the light coming from its windows at night transformed it into something that seemed alive. A great golden lantern above the city. She would have attended services there on the major feast days, pressing into the nave with thousands of other ordinary citizens, the smoke of the incense thick in the air, the choir in the gallery above, sending the music down through the space, the mosaics of the saints glimmering in the candlelight. She would have watched, from a safe distance, the processions of emperors arriving for coronations. She would have heard the roar from the hippodrome on race days, even as the hippodrome aged and races became rarer. She would have gossiped with her neighbors about the theological controversies in the same breath as she commented on the quality of the Egyptian grain arriving that season. Her bread is gone, her name is gone, but the forum where she worked is still there, buried under 15 centuries of sediment, its columns still standing in some places, its stones incorporated into the walls of later buildings. The street is still there, still running roughly where it ran in her time. Istanbul's old city is built on top of Constantinople, which is built on top of Byzantium, which is built on top of the nameless settlements that preceded them all. The layers go down and down. There was also a young student in the 12th century, studying at the school attached to the Patriarchal Church, one of the few remaining centers of formal education in a city that had once had a university. He studied the ancient texts, not just the Bible and the Church Fathers, but Plato and Homer and the historians of ancient Greece and Rome. His teachers were men who had memorized vast quantities of classical literature and who taught their students to love its precision and its beauty. He would have written his exercises on wax tablets and recited poetry aloud in the echoing marble corridors of the school. He dreamed, probably, of becoming a palace secretary, one of the elegant, literate men who drafted imperial correspondence and kept the records of the vast bureaucracy that, even in the 12th century when the empire had shrunk, still required hundreds of clerks and officials to function. The palace still employed scholars. There was still a place for a bright young man from the provinces who could write Greek prose in the classical style. He may have achieved that dream, or he may have died in one of the recurring epidemics that swept the city every generation. Or he may have joined a monastery. Or he may have become a merchant, trading in the silks that the empire still monopolized. His story is lost, but the texts he read are not lost. The Homer he memorized is the same Homer we read. The Plato he studied is the same Plato whose dialogues are read in universities today. The chain of transmission goes through Byzantium, through those cold marble schoolrooms, through the hands of the monks who copied the manuscripts, through the scholars who fled to Italy after 1453 with their precious cargo of books. When we read Thucydides, we are reading something that survived because someone in Byzantine Constantinople thought it worth keeping. That is not a small thing. There was a night in the winter of 618, during the Persian siege of the city that coincided with the Avar siege of the land walls, when Constantinople was simultaneously threatened from the sea, where Persian forces had aligned with the Avars, and from the land. The Patriarch Sergius organized a night procession around the entire circuit of the walls, carrying icons of the Virgin Mary and singing the hymn called the Akathist, which means the hymn sung standing because it was considered too sacred to be heard while seated. The procession went through the night, the voices of the clergy and the people rising in the darkness above the sound of the enemy encampment outside. The Avars withdrew without taking the city. The Orthodox tradition attributed the deliverance to the Virgin Mary, who was thereafter the special protector of Constantinople, her image above the Blackenay Gate and at the harbours and at every gate of the city, watching over the walls that held the world's most magnificent city in its improbable, golden, tenacious existence. The hymn they sang that night is still sung in Orthodox churches every year during Lent. It is called the Akathist hymn to the Theotokos, the God-bearer, and its first verse translates roughly as, "To the champion general, I, your city, dedicate the fruits of victory." As an offering of gratitude, the hymn thanks the Virgin for defending the city. After the deliverance from the Avars and Persians, it was understood to be directed not just at the church, but at Constantinople itself, the city singing its own thanksgiving for its survival. The city sang that hymn for the last time, in its original context, on the night of the 28th of May, 1453. Let me tell you about Greek fire. Nobody knows exactly what Greek fire was. The formula was a state secret, guarded as carefully as any military technology in the ancient world, transmitted only within a few trusted families who served as the empire's naval artificers. What we know from contemporary descriptions is that it was a liquid that burned, that it could be propelled from bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships, that it floated on the surface of water and continued to burn even when doused with water, that it could only be extinguished with sand or urine or vinegar. It was first used in a naval engagement in 678 during the first Arab siege of Constantinople, and its effect was reportedly terrifying. The Arab fleet was destroyed. The fire clung to the wooden hulls of their ships and burned them down to the waterline. The survivors reported that it fell from the sky like burning rain, that it seemed like the city was defended by supernatural fire. We have theories about what it contained. Naphtha, the natural petroleum that seeps from the ground in parts of the Middle East, is the most likely base component. Quicklime, which reacts violently with water, may have been part of the formula, explaining its capacity to keep burning even when wet. Pine resin, sulfur, and other substances may have been involved, but no one has ever definitively reconstructed the exact formula because the secret died with the empire. Greek fire saved Constantinople in 678. It saved it again in 718, when the Second Arab Siege was defeated partly by the same burning liquid. It was a strategic weapon of such importance that the Byzantines never allowed it to be manufactured outside the capital, never traded the knowledge for any diplomatic advantage, protected it for centuries as the most valuable secret the empire possessed. Some historians have speculated that one of the reasons Constantinople's fall in 1453 was possible was that the Byzantine navy by that point was so diminished that even Greek fire would not have made a significant difference. But the formula was still known in the final years. It was still a secret worth keeping. And when the city fell, the secret went with it. Some things are lost forever. That formula is one of them. There are stories about the last weeks of Constantinople that have the quality of dreams. There was an icon in the Church of the Holy Apostles, a mosaic of the Virgin so old that its origins were attributed to Saint Luke himself, the evangelist who had also been a painter. Whether this attribution was historically possible was irrelevant to the people of Constantinople, who had venerated this image for as long as anyone could remember. In the last weeks before the fall, a procession carried this icon through the streets, praying for deliverance, and a contemporary account describes how the icon slipped from the hands of its bearers and fell to the ground, and when they tried to lift it, it could not be moved. It sat in the mud of the street while the people wept, and then finally they managed to raise it and continue. They took it as a sign. There was also an account of a strange light that appeared over the city in the final days, a glow above the dome of the Hagia Sophia that some interpreted as the glory of God departing from the building, as the glory of God had departed from the temple in Jerusalem. According to the book of Ezekiel, the Ottoman accounts mention a strange light too, but interpret it differently, as a sign that God was granting the city to Mehmed. On the night before the final assault, a full moon was supposed to rise. But the moon rose dark, occluded, in what looked like a lunar eclipse, and the people of Constantinople, who knew their Ezekiel and their other prophecies, saw in this another sign that the end had come. The darkness of the moon over a city that had always associated itself with divine protection was unbearable. Constantine the 11th was not a man given to mystical interpretation. He was, by the accounts we have of him, a practical, duty-bound soldier who had spent his adult life fighting in the Peloponnese, and dealing with the impossible politics of a shrinking empire. But on the night of the 28th of May, standing in the Hagia Sophia, watching his city pray for the last time, he must have felt the weight of everything that word implied. He was the 138th emperor in the line that began with Constantine the First. In the throne room behind the hippodrome, the porphyry slab on which the emperors stood for their coronations still bore the footprints worn into the stone by 1,000 years of ceremony. He had stood on those footprints when he was crowned. He would die without passing them on to anyone. The Roman Empire, which had begun with Augustus in 27 BC, would end in the rubble of its most beautiful city on a May morning in 1453. 1,480 years, more or less, from beginning to end, the longest-running political entity in the Western world. It ended because a man of 21 had a vision of greatness and the tools to achieve it, and because the empire he was ending had been hollowed out over centuries by plague and theological dispute and military defeat and the extraordinary, structural bad luck of being on the wrong side of every shift in economic and military power for 500 years. It ended because walls, however magnificent, are not enough if there are no men to stand on them. It ended because history ends things, eventually, no matter how beautiful they are. The Hagia Sophia stands. In 1934, the founder of the Turkish Republic, Kemal Atatürk, converted it from a mosque to a museum, a gesture that balanced its Christian past and its Islamic centuries, and placed it in the neutral ground of human heritage. For 86 years it was a museum, and visitors from every country in the world walked its nave and looked up at the floating dome and felt what every visitor has felt since 537, the particular silence of a space that was designed to make you feel small in the most exhilarating possible way. In 2020, it was reconverted to a mosque, a decision that drew criticism from governments and heritage organizations around the world. The mosaics remain visible, though some are covered during prayer times. The building is still open to visitors, still one of the most visited sites on Earth. When you walk into the Hagia Sophia, you are walking into the body of every person who has ever walked there before you. The Byzantine emperors and their golden court, the monks chanting through the night offices, the ordinary bakers and students and fishermen who pressed into the nave on feast days, the Crusader soldiers who stabled their horses in it in 1204, the Ottoman soldiers who prayed in it in 1453, the scholars and pilgrims and tourists of every century since. The stone floor is worn smooth. The light comes through the same windows, at the same angles, that it came through in Justinian's time. The dome floats on its ring of light, as it has floated for nearly 15 centuries. Istanbul is built on 7 hills. So was Constantinople. So was Rome. 7 hills is what you need to hold the world in your hands, or at least to feel like you might. From the top of any of those hills on a clear day, you can see the Bosphorus, that narrow strip of water that separates Europe from Asia. That has been the reason for this city's existence since Byzas climbed his headland in 657 BC and understood that the people on the other side were blind. The water still moves through the strait, as it has always moved. The great ships still pass, as they have always passed, though they carry containers of electronics and automobiles now instead of grain and silk and amphoras of wine. The seagulls still wheel over the Golden Horn. The call to prayer still rises 5 times a day from the minarets. The city is still there. The city is still there. That is, when you think about it, the most remarkable thing. That something so beautiful, so complicated, so layered in suffering and genius and cruelty and faith, should have survived all the things that have been done to it and around it and through it. That it should still be breathing. That people should still be walking its streets, selling bread near the foundations of forums, building their houses on top of the ruins of houses built on top of ruins, going back 27 centuries. Cities are not supposed to survive like this. But some cities have an argument with mortality that they simply refuse to lose. Constantinople was one of them. Istanbul still is. The story we have told tonight is not complete. It never could be. 15 centuries of history cannot be fully told in any amount of time. There were emperors we did not mention. Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, who blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners and sent them home, led by guides who had been left one eye each to navigate, and who wept when he finally reached Jerusalem after years of campaign. Zoe, the empress who married 3 times and adopted a 4th husband as her son to give him the purple, whose mosaic portrait still gazes down from the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, her small, jeweled hands raised in the attitude of prayer. Andronikos Komnenos, who was pulled through the streets of Constantinople by a furious mob and tortured to death over 3 days in 1185, an emperor whose charm and intelligence and ultimate cruelty contained all of Byzantine politics in one biographical arc. We did not tell the full story of the Fourth Crusade's aftermath, the strange half-century of Latin rule, when a French emperor sat in the palace where the heirs of Rome had ruled for 8 centuries, and the grotesque economic terms the Venetians extracted that made them effectively the commercial masters of the city, even after the Byzantines returned. We did not tell the full story of the Ottoman Empire that replaced Byzantium, which was itself extraordinary, which produced Suleiman the Magnificent and Sinan the architect, who built the Blue Mosque and the Topkapi Palace and transformed the city again, which lasted until 1922, and whose dissolution produced the modern states of the Middle East, whose borders we are still arguing about. We did not tell the story of the Janissaries, the slave soldiers of the Ottoman Empire who were recruited as boys from Christian families throughout the Balkans, converted to Islam, trained from childhood to be the elite warriors of the Sultan, who became so powerful that they eventually made and unmade sultans themselves, just as the Byzantine palace guard had made and unmade emperors, because proximity to power is its own kind of power. We did not tell the story of the Black Death sweeping through the city in 1347, arriving from the Crimea on Genoese trading ships, killing perhaps 1/3 of the population in a few months, filling the streets with bodies that the living barely had time to bury. We did not tell the story of Mehmed II's library, because the same man who conquered Constantinople was also a scholar who collected manuscripts and corresponded with Italian humanists, and was genuinely interested in the intellectual heritage of the city he had taken. He preserved what he found. He invited Greek scholars to remain. He had himself painted in Italian style by Gentile Bellini, sitting for a formal portrait in the Western manner. The conqueror of the last Roman city also being painted in the style of Renaissance Florence, because the world had already become too small for simple categories. We did not tell all of it. No one ever tells all of it. But perhaps we have told enough to give you a sense of the city on its headland, the water on every side, the dome floating above it all, enough to make you feel the weight of what it meant when those gates finally opened in the grey light of a May morning. Enough to understand why, when a young soldier of Constantine's bodyguard fled through the chaos of the final hours and made it to a ship in the harbour, he may have looked back at the city as it disappeared behind him, and known that he had lived through the end of something that could not come again. The Roman Empire was over, but the city was still there, already beginning its next life, still standing on its 7 hills, still watching the water move through the strait, still dreaming, in its ancient stones, the long and complicated dream of everything that had been and everything that was yet to come. Now the night is deep. If you have followed this story from the beginning, you have travelled from the 8th century before Christ to the 15th century after it. You have walked the Theodosian walls and stood in the Hagia Sophia and heard the cannons of Mehmed II and watched the last emperor ride toward his death. You are probably tired. That's good. That's what we came here for. History is a slow thing, underneath all its violence. It moves like water, wearing away stone, depositing sediment, carrying things from where they began to where they end up. The stones of Constantinople have been worn smooth by more history than almost any other place on earth, and that smoothness is a kind of peace. Let the city settle in your mind like sediment in deep water. Let the dome float in the darkness behind your eyes. Let the bells that Constantine rang when he dedicated his city, let them roll softly across the hills one more time, and then let them fade. The city is there. It is always there. The water moves through the strait as it has always moved. And you are here, In whatever room you are in whatever city, at whatever hour of the night, breathing slowly. The world is old and mostly sleeping. Let it hold you. Let it hold you. Good night. Let me take you back to the beginning one more time, because there are things about the founding that deserve to be held longer in the mind. When Constantine chose his site, he was not simply choosing a strategic location, though it was the finest strategic location on earth. He was making a statement about what the Roman Empire was and what it would become. He was saying, in the language of architecture and geography, that the future lay east. That the Mediterranean world that Augustus had united was no longer the whole story. That there was a vast hinterland of trade and faith and conflict beyond the old boundaries of the Roman world, and that the empire needed to be positioned to engage with it. He was right about this. He was right in a way that outlasted his own reign, his own dynasty, his own religion as he practiced it, by more than 1,000 years. The city he built on that headland was, for most of its existence, the most sophisticated urban environment on Earth. At a time when the cities of Western Europe had collapsed into small towns, Constantinople maintained working sewers. It maintained an aqueduct system that brought fresh water from the hills of Thrace, 60 miles away, carried through stone channels and across great stone arches that you can still see standing in the hills outside Istanbul. It maintained a network of underground cisterns, vast subterranean chambers with columns rising from the floor to support the vaulted ceiling that stored enough water to supply the city through years of siege. The most famous of these, the Basilica Cistern, built under Justinian, holds 80,000 cubic meters of water and is supported by 336 columns, many of them taken from earlier buildings across the empire, so that the bases include two colossal Medusa heads, placed sideways and upside down, their function structural rather than symbolic, their presence haunting in the underground half-light. You can visit the Basilica Cistern today. You walk down a long staircase into the darkness and find yourself in a forest of columns rising from dark water, lit by underwater lights that make the reflections move on the ceiling. Fish swim among the columns, calm and permanent. The Medusa heads watch you from below the waterline. It is one of the strangest and most beautiful spaces in the world, and it was built in the 6th century to keep a city alive through whatever catastrophe might come. Constantinople planned for catastrophe. Its granaries could hold enough food to feed the entire population for years. Its walls were designed not just to repel assault, but to sustain a siege of indefinite length. The city had water when the aqueducts were cut. It had food when the harbors were blockaded. It had fire when the navy was threatened. It had walls when the army was absent. The city was not merely defended, it was engineered for survival. And it survived things that should have killed it a dozen times over. There was the plague, not just the Great Plague of 541, the Justinianic plague that we have already mentioned, but recurring waves of it over the next 200 years. Each wave carried off thousands, then tens of thousands. The city shrank, and then recovered, and then shrank again. The tax base that paid for the walls and the navy and the grain reserves declined with the population, but the city survived. There was the Avar and Persian siege of 626, which we touched on briefly, a moment when the city was simultaneously threatened by land and sea, when Constantinople was genuinely surrounded in a way it had never been before. The land walls held, the chain held. The Byzantine navy deployed Greek fire in the Golden Horn and burned the Persian boats that were attempting to ferry Avar troops across. The city survived. There was the earthquake of 557, which damaged the dome of the Hagia Sophia so severely that it partially collapsed and had to be rebuilt at a different pitch. The rebuilt dome, rising higher and narrower than the original, and by most accounts, more beautiful. An earthquake did what no army had managed to do, and damaged the greatest building in the world. They rebuilt it in 4 years. There were famines and floods and fires. Constantinople burned in whole districts at least once a generation for most of its history, because a city of wooden houses packed tightly together is always vulnerable to fire, and because the winds that funnel through the Bosphorus can carry sparks for miles. The Great Fire of 465 burned so much of the city that the Emperor Leo had to impose special taxes to fund the rebuilding. The fire that accompanied the Nika riots in 532 destroyed the center of the city. There were fires in the 7th century and the 9th and the 13th, each one leaving a scar that the city slowly filled in, growing back over its wounds, like a tree growing over an old cut. Cities that survive catastrophe develop a particular kind of character. They become both resilient and melancholy, aware of their own fragility in a way that comfortable cities never are. Constantinople knew what it meant to be almost lost. Its people had heard the stories of the great sieges, had stood in the churches on the feast days that commemorated deliverances, had grown up with the knowledge that the city's existence was not inevitable, but chosen, again and again, by the people who defended it, and the God they believed defended them. This knowledge made them, in certain lights, magnificent. It also made them, in other lights, exhausted. The sheer weight of continuity, the burden of being the center of the world for so long, the impossible task of maintaining a standard of civilization set 1,000 years ago, pressed down on the later Byzantines with a force that sometimes shows in their writing, in their art, in the way the painting of the 12th and 13th centuries grows a little darker, a little more severe. The faces of the saints more gaunt and intense than the rounder, warmer faces of the earlier mosaics. They knew they were living in diminishment. They continued anyway. That is perhaps the most Byzantine thing about them. Let us talk about the water. Constantinople is not just surrounded by water. It is defined by it. The Bosphorus to the east, the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Golden Horn to the north, that curved inlet whose name comes from its golden color at sunset, when the light catches the water at the right angle, and the whole surface glows as if lit from underneath. The Byzantine relationship with the sea was as complicated and central as anything else in their history. They were, at their height, a maritime empire. Their navy was the instrument of their survival, the force that defeated the Arab fleets in 678 and 718, that patrolled the trade routes of the Aegean and the Black Sea, that projected imperial power to the shores of Italy and Egypt and Syria. The harbour at Constantinople in the great centuries was one of the busiest in the world, a permanent chaos of merchant ships and warships and fishing boats, and the small craft that ferried people and goods between the city and its suburbs across the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn was also a barrier. The chain that stretched across its mouth was one of the key elements of the city's defence, as important in its way as the Theodosian walls. When it was intact, no enemy fleet could enter the harbour. When it was circumvented, as the Ottomans circumvented it by hauling their ships overland in 1453, the equation changed. But for most of the city's history, the chain held. There is something poetic about the fact that the most important piece of hardware in the defense of one of the world's greatest cities was a chain. Not a wall, not a weapon, but a barrier of linked iron. It was deployed in darkness, beneath the surface, stretched between towers on opposite shores. Enemies approaching in the night could not see it until they hit it. It stopped everything. When the chain was raised at night and the harbour closed, the city was an island. Surrounded on 3 sides by water, closed on the 4th by the walls, Constantinople had nothing outside it to worry about. The sounds that came from beyond the walls, the campfires of besieging armies, the distant voices of soldiers in languages the citizens did not understand, were sounds from another world. Inside the chain and inside the walls, the city continued. People slept and woke and went to market and argued about theology and fell in love and died of old age and were born. And the water surrounded it all, the water that had made the city possible and that protected it, and that, in the end, could not quite save it. The Ottoman solution to the chain was characteristic of Mehmed II. When you cannot defeat an obstacle by attacking it directly, find another way. The overland shipment of the fleet was an enormous logistical undertaking, requiring the felling of trees, the greasing of logs, the harnessing of oxen, and the moving of ships that weighed hundreds of tons across nearly a mile of hilly ground in a single night. It was done. By morning, the Ottoman fleet was in the Golden Horn. and the chain had been bypassed. When the defenders on the sea walls of the Golden Horn looked out at dawn and saw Ottoman ships in the harbour they had believed was protected, the psychological effect was as devastating as any military defeat. It was the moment when the people of Constantinople understood, finally and completely, that the old guarantees no longer held. There is a sound that Constantinople makes that no other city makes, and it is the sound of its position. The Bosphorus is not just a body of water. It is a current, one of the strongest in the world, running from the Black Sea to the Marmara, driven by the difference in water levels between the two seas and by the density differential between the fresher Black Sea water and the saltier Mediterranean water that fills the Marmara. The surface current runs south. There is a countercurrent running north beneath it, carrying saltier water back into the Black Sea. When the wind blows in certain directions against the current, the strait becomes very rough, the surface choppy and difficult, the spray white in the narrows. When the wind and current run together, the water moves fast and smooth, the ships riding it south toward the Marmara with almost no effort. Ships have been reading this current since the Bronze Age. The Argonauts of Greek mythology, sailing for the Golden Fleece, had to fight their way north against it. The Phoenician traders, who first charted the Black Sea, learned its rhythms. The Athenian grain ships that supplied their city, dependent on the grain of the Crimean coast, had to navigate it twice a year, north in spring and south in fall. Constantinople sat at the controlling point of this navigation. You could not go north without passing under its walls. You could not come south without its permission. This is still true. The Bosphorus is still one of the most heavily trafficked waterways on Earth, and the ships that pass through it, enormous tankers carrying oil from the Caspian Sea and bulk carriers loaded with Black Sea grain, still navigate the same currents that Bronze Age sailors learned to read. Istanbul still controls the strait. The city is still, in the most fundamental geographical sense, the city it has always been. The city at the crossing. This is what Byzantium saw in 657 BC. This is what Constantine saw in 324 AD. This is what Mehmed II saw in 1451, when he began to plan his conquest. Control the strait, and you control the trade between two seas, and you sit at the junction where the old world's great networks of exchange must pass. No amount of political change, no amount of conquest and reconquest can move the strait. The geography is permanent. The city that stands on it will always be the center of something, as long as there are people to understand what the center means. Let me tell you about the last patriarch. His name was Gennadios Scholarios, and he was an unlikely figure to become the leader of the surviving Greek Orthodox community under Ottoman rule. He had been a scholar, a theologian, a man of books and arguments, one of the delegates to the Council of Florence, where the union with Rome had been debated and reluctantly accepted. He had signed the union at Florence. He had come home and recanted it. He had become one of the loudest voices against the theological compromise, despite having initially agreed to it, which tells you something about the pressures that operated on Byzantine intellectuals in the last decades of the empire. When Mehmed II needed to appoint a patriarch to lead the Greek Christian community, he turned to Gennadios, who had refused the patriarchal throne twice before, but who now accepted it, perhaps because the survival of the community required someone to lead it. Mehmed gave Gennadios his staff of office with his own hands, and sent him through the city to his church, mounted on a horse with an Ottoman escort, with the dignity of a senior official of the new empire. Gennadios led his community until 1456, and then retired to a monastery. The patriarchate he headed survived under Ottoman rule for the next 4.5 centuries, continuing to this day, the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, still technically in Istanbul, still leading the world's Orthodox Christian community. From a small building in the Fena district of the city, its jurisdiction reduced, but its continuity unbroken from the time of Constantine. The patriarchate outlasted the empire. That is the kind of institutional tenacity that only the very deep roots of faith can sustain. Now let us return to Justinian for a moment, because there is one more thing about him that deserves to be said, and it is the thing that perhaps explains him better than any of his military campaigns or his legal codifications. He never slept. This is not a metaphor. Contemporary accounts are consistent about it. He was reported to have the physical constitution that required very little sleep, perhaps 3 or 4 hours a night, and to spend the rest of the time working, reading, discussing theology, receiving petitions, dictating correspondence. He fasted rigorously, eating very simply and very little. He was, by all accounts, physically tireless in a way that exhausted the people around him. But there is a story about Justinian that is darker than simple industriousness. Procopius, the historian who wrote the official panegyrics praising Justinian, but who also wrote, in secret, the Anecdota, the secret history, a savage private account of the court, describes something about the emperor that he clearly found disturbing. He says that Justinian could sometimes be seen walking through the palace at night without his head. This is obviously not literal. Procopius was a sophisticated writer, and he almost certainly meant something more like what we would call the impression of a man who seemed not quite fully present, not quite fully human, whose tirelessness and whose emotional detachment from the suffering his campaigns caused made him seem, to those who knew him, like something that was not entirely of this world. Or perhaps Procopius was writing under enough fear that he did not dare say directly what he meant, and the headless emperor walking through the night corridors was the closest he could come to saying that the most powerful man in the world was, in some essential way, empty. The great emperors of Constantinople were often like this, brilliant and cold, capable of extraordinary generosity and extraordinary cruelty, their public face so carefully constructed and maintained that the private person, if there was one, became invisible. The elaborate ceremonial of the Byzantine court was not just about projecting power, it was about creating distance, about surrounding the emperor with so many layers of protocol and ritual that he became not a man, but an office. The office of the Roman emperor, the vicar of God on earth, the master of the world. The cost of inhabiting that office for a lifetime must have been enormous. Some emperors, by the end of their reigns, seem to have been consumed by it. Justinian, at the end of his 38 years, was a very old man who had outlived nearly everyone he had known and most of what he had built. Belisarius, his great general, had been disgraced and restored and disgraced again and died before him. Theodora had died of cancer in 548, when she was probably in her late 40s, and Justinian never remarried and is reported to have never fully recovered from her loss. The empire he had expanded had already begun to contract before he died. He left behind the law code and the Hagia Sophia, and perhaps the headless shape of a man walking through dark corridors in the small hours of the morning, alone in the palace that was the largest building complex in the world, the heir of Rome and the servant of God, and underneath all the gold and the purple, just a man who could not sleep. There is a ceremony that was practiced at the Byzantine court for centuries that I want to describe to you because it is one of the most vivid things I know about the way the Byzantines understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. On certain feast days, the emperor would process from the palace to the Hagia Sophia along the main ceremonial route, accompanied by the full court, the officials in their ranked silks of different colours, the guards in their armour, the clergy in their vestments. The streets would be cleared and decorated. The citizens would line the route, standing in organised ranks, not simply watching, but participating, because on certain occasions they were expected to cry out specific acclamations, hailing the emperor and calling down divine blessing on him, in voices that rose and fell in the prescribed patterns, like a musical performance. The emperor moved through this soundscape like a figure in a dream, slowly, robed in purple and gold, wearing a crown so heavy that it sometimes had to be supported by wires attached to a frame. He did not turn his head or acknowledge the crowd with a wave. He moved with the fixed, formal deliberateness of a figure in a mosaic, because he was, in a very real sense, imitating a mosaic. The mosaics in the Hagia Sophia showed Christ and the emperors and the saints in exactly this frontal, formal, immobile pose, because that pose represented a being outside time, a being who was not subject to the distractions of the physical world. The emperor was God's representative on earth, and God's representatives did not wave. He would enter the Hagia Sophia, and take his place in the imperial loge, the screened gallery above the nave, where the emperor stood during the liturgy, visible to the congregation below, but separated from them by the carved marble screen. The liturgy would proceed, the choir singing in the galleries, the incense rising, the priests moving through the choreographed gestures of the divine liturgy, the same liturgy that Orthodox Christians still perform today, in the same words, the same music, the same gestures, in churches from Alaska to South Africa. After the liturgy, the emperor would descend to the nave and perform the proskynesis before the altar, the deep prostration that acknowledged not his authority, but his submission to a higher authority. Then he would process back to the palace, the acclamations rising again in the streets. The whole ceremony might last hours. It happened dozens of times a year, on the feast days of the major saints, and on the anniversaries of imperial victories, and on the coronation days of current and past emperors. It was exhausting and magnificent, and deeply strange, and it was the mechanism by which the Byzantine court maintained the fiction, or the truth, depending on your perspective, that the emperor ruled not by force, but by divine election, not by ambition, but by cosmic necessity, not as a man, but as an icon. An icon does not age. An icon does not doubt. An icon does not need to sleep. The ceremonies went on for 1,000 years, and then they stopped. The Greek scholars who fled Constantinople after 1453 arrived in Italy with their manuscripts and their memories and their hunger for the civilization they had lost. They taught Greek in the schools of Florence and Venice and Rome. They argued Platonic philosophy in the academies that the Italian humanists had established. They brought with them not just texts, but a living tradition of reading those texts, a tradition of commentary and argument that went back without interruption to the ancient world. The most famous of these scholars was probably Bessarion, a cardinal who had been born in Trebizond, educated in Constantinople, converted to Roman Catholicism at Florence as part of the Union negotiations, and who spent the rest of his life in Rome as a patron and collector of Greek manuscripts. When he died in 1472, he left his collection to Venice, where it became the foundation of the Bibliotheca Marciana, the great library of Venice that still holds, among hundreds of other Byzantine manuscripts, some of the oldest surviving copies of Greek texts that exist anywhere in the world. Bessarion understood what he was preserving. He understood that the manuscripts he collected were not just beautiful objects or diplomatic gifts or tokens of his scholarly status. They were the last copies of things that could not be replaced. If they were lost, those voices were lost forever. He spent his life and his money making sure they were not lost. This is what it means to be the carrier of a civilization in its final hour, not to defend it with a sword, which was Constantine the XI's role, and which had its own terrible dignity, but to carry it out through the burning city and deposit it somewhere safe, so that when the fire died down there was still something left to build from. Bessarion carried it, others carried it. The books survived, and the Renaissance, which was already happening when Constantinople fell, burned brighter for what the Byzantine scholars brought to it. The civilization of Greece and Rome, which Constantinople had preserved for 1,000 years, while the Western world forgot it, came back to the West in the hands of the people who had kept it. That is not nothing. That is perhaps everything. The city has been described many times by people who saw it for the first time and felt that they were seeing something that should not have been possible, something so large and so beautiful that the mind refused to take it in all at once. The Crusaders who approached Constantinople from the west in 1097, the men of the First Crusade, had mostly never seen a city larger than Paris or Cologne, and Paris, at that time, was perhaps 30,000 people living in wooden houses on an island in the Seine. They came over the hills and looked down and saw Constantinople spread across its peninsula below them. Its domes and its walls and its harbours, its population of perhaps 400,000, and some of them reportedly wept, not from sadness, but from the shock of confronting something so far beyond their experience that it seemed like something from another world. Anna Komnene describes them in the Alexiad with the cool detachment of a woman who has lived her entire life inside the most sophisticated civilization on Earth, and who finds these large, loud Westerners simultaneously impressive in their ferocity and slightly ridiculous in their amazement at what seemed to her perfectly ordinary things. She describes Bohemond of Taranto's physical beauty with a specificity that suggests she was drawn to him even as she found his culture barbarous. She is one of the first women in history to write a major historical work, and she wrote it in her old age, in a monastery where she had retreated after her attempt to claim the throne for herself had failed. She wanted to be empress. She had been destined, in her childhood, to marry a Byzantine prince and become empress through that marriage. The arrangement fell through. Her brother John became emperor instead. She plotted against him. She failed. She went to the monastery and she wrote. The Alexiad is one of the greatest works of Byzantine literature. It is also one of the great acts of sublimation in literary history. A brilliant, ambitious woman who could not be empress becoming instead the biographer of the emperor she had wanted to succeed, preserving his reign in language that would outlast both of them. Let me tell you about the color purple. The Byzantine emperors wore purple because purple was the color of absolute power. This was not an arbitrary convention. It went back to ancient Rome, where the Tyrian purple dye, extracted from the murex sea snail at tremendous expense and effort, was so costly that only emperors could afford to wear it in significant quantities. A toga border of Tyrian purple indicated senatorial rank. An entire garment dyed Tyrian purple indicated imperial rank. The color became the color of power itself, so much so that to be elevated to the imperial dignity was described as being elevated to the purple, and to be born while your father was emperor, as Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, a title that indicated the most legitimate possible claim to the throne. In Constantinople, there was a room in the palace called the Porphyra, the purple chamber, whose walls and ceiling were lined with porphyry, the purple-red stone quarried in Egypt that was used for imperial sarcophagi and imperial columns and imperial monuments throughout the Roman and Byzantine world. This was the room where imperial children were supposed to be born, so that their bodies would touch the imperial stone at the first moment of their lives. Being born in the porphyry room was a political statement, a claim to legitimacy before the child had drawn its first breath. The purple was not just a colour, it was a sacrament. When the last Latin emperor fled Constantinople in 1261, leaving the city back to the Byzantines, he did not take the crown with him. He had, apparently, already pawned it. He sailed away with less than he had come with. Michael Palaiologos entered the city and walked through the Golden Gate as the restored emperor of the Romans. And however depleted the empire had become, however much of it had been sold or burned or lost, he was wearing purple. And when Constantine the 11th died in the rubble of the walls in 1453, the Ottoman soldiers who found a body they believed was his identified it, according to several accounts, by the purple boots it was wearing. He had stripped himself of his imperial insignia. He had removed the crown and the golden robes that would have marked him as a target. He had died as a soldier, fighting, but he had kept the boots, purple, to the end. The dome of the Hagia Sophia is 49 meters across at its widest point. It rises 35 meters above the windows that ring its base. When you stand on the floor of the nave and look up, the dome is 55 meters above you. It has a crack. The crack appeared in the original dome, probably during the earthquake of 557 that caused the partial collapse and the rebuilding. After the rebuilding, cracks continued to appear and be repaired. The dome has been repaired many times over its 15 centuries. It has new mortar. It has steel reinforcements added in the 19th century by a Swiss-Italian architect named Fossati, who restored the building extensively for the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid. It has monitoring equipment attached to it today, seismometers and sensors that track its behavior in the earthquakes that are a constant feature of life in Istanbul, a city that sits in one of the most seismically active zones on Earth. The engineers who study the dome say that Anthemius and Isidore built something that has its own structural logic, that the way the dome transfers its weight to the half-domes and the piers is more sophisticated than it appears, that the building has survived, not by luck, but by a deep intelligence in its design that the builders may not even have been fully conscious of, working, as they were, by geometric intuition rather than modern structural analysis. The crack is still there. It has been repaired many times, and it will be repaired again. The dome that floats on its ring of windows has been floating for nearly 1,500 years, and it has every intention of continuing to float. What they built in 6 years. Those two mathematician architects working for an emperor who never slept has outlasted every empire that has tried to claim it. It belonged to Justinian, and then to the Latin Church in the brief, terrible years after 1204, and then to the Orthodox Church again, and then to Islam, and then to the secular Republic of Turkey, and now to Islam again. The building is indifferent to ownership. It floats above all of it. This is what it means to build something truly extraordinary. It escapes you. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood inside it and felt what every visitor feels, the vertiginous sense of being small, and the equally vertiginous sense that being small in the presence of something this beautiful is not diminishment, but privilege. The last thing I want to tell you about is the sound of the city. Not the sound of cannon fire, or the screaming of an assault, or the chanting of a liturgy, though all those sounds were real. The everyday sound. The sound the city made when nothing was happening, when it was just itself. Every morning, the bells. Not one bell, because one bell would have been insufficient for a city of hundreds of thousands. Dozens of bells, from the great cathedral bells of the Hagia Sophia and the Apostolian and the other major churches, down to the smaller bells of the neighborhood churches scattered through every quarter of the city, each ringing its own pattern at slightly different pitches, the whole creating a vast and complicated music that moved across the city with the morning light. The bells marked the canonical hours, the 7 times of daily prayer that structured Byzantine monastic life, and by extension, the rhythm of the city around it. When the bells rang, people paused. Workers in the markets, sailors in the harbour, students in the schools, officials in the palace corridors, all stopped for a moment and turned toward whatever church was nearest. The day was marked by these pauses, these moments of collective orientation, the entire city turning together towards something beyond itself. And then the birds. Constantinople has always had birds. The seagulls over the Bosphorus, the pigeons in the forums and the courtyards, the swallows that nest in the stone of old buildings. In summer, the swifts, arriving from Africa, screaming in the updrafts above the hills. The birds do not care about empires. They have been nesting in the stones of this city since before Constantine, and they will be nesting there long after the last human who calls the city home has gone. The market sounds. The merchants calling their goods in Greek and Armenian and Syriac and Latin, and later Turkish and Italian and Arabic. The animals, because medieval cities had animals everywhere, chickens in the courtyards and donkeys in the streets, and the occasional cow being led from the suburbs to the butcher and the dogs. Everywhere the dogs. Constantinople's legendary street dog population that has always existed and exists still. The city's semi-feral, but generally amiable canine inhabitants who are fed by the residents and who sleep in the squares and who are, in the estimation of some travellers, among the more philosophical presences in the city, the sound of water. The city was full of fountains, fed by the aqueducts and the cisterns, and the sound of running water was constant in the forums and the courtyards and the public spaces. Water in Constantinople was a luxury and a political statement. The emperor who maintained the aqueducts and kept the fountains running was fulfilling one of the most basic obligations of the state toward its citizens. When the aqueduct was cut during a siege and the fountains went dry, the silence was frightening. The sound of prayer, not just the bells, but the voices, monastic chanting, carrying across the city from the dozens of monasteries tucked into its neighborhoods. The deacons calling the liturgical responses in the churches, and later, from the minarets that replaced the bell towers after 1453, the muezzin's call, 5 times a day, the Arabic words carrying across the city that had once rung with Greek. Both sounds belong to the city. Both sounds have a claim on it. The city has been praying, in one language or another, since the day Constantine dedicated it with Christian ceremonies in 330. It has not stopped praying yet. I have been talking for a long time now, and the night is deep around you. We have moved through 11 centuries of a city's life, from Constantine's vision on the Bosphorus to Mehmed's entry through the Fallen Gate, and we have touched, as lightly as we could, while still being faithful, on the lives of the people who filled those centuries. There are so many more stories. The story of the Bulgarian Tsar Simeon, who spent most of the early 10th century trying to take Constantinople and never managed it, dying of a heart attack within sight of the walls in 927 after a lifetime of siege and negotiation. The story of the Varangian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguard recruited from the Norse and later from the Anglo-Saxon English, who had lost their lands after Hastings and came east to serve the Byzantine Emperor, bringing their axes and their languages and their extraordinary alcohol tolerance to the most sophisticated court in Christendom. The story of Alexius, the first's daughter Anna, and her unsuccessful bid for power, which sent her to the monastery where she wrote the Alexiad, one of the great consolations literature offers for the loss of a throne. The story of Manuel I Komnenos, who jousted with the Crusaders in the Western fashion, commissioned Western-style architecture, and married a Western princess, the most Latinized of Byzantine emperors, who nearly recovered the empire's old eastern territory and then lost it catastrophically at the Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176. The story of the Crusaders camping outside the walls in the winter of 1203, hungry and cold, watching the lights of the great city across the water, the city that the poorest among them knew was richer than any city they had ever seen, and feeling the mixture of awe and resentment and desire that the wealthy always inspire in the desperate. The story of the ordinary people who carried their belongings on their backs as the Ottoman army came through the breached walls, pushing toward the harbours in the desperate hope of finding a ship. Some made it. Many did not. Those who did not became part of the great diaspora of Greeks, who carried Byzantine culture to Venice and Florence and Crete and Cyprus and the other corners of the Mediterranean world, where Orthodox Christians could find some version of home. The story of those who stayed, who remained in Constantinople under Ottoman rule, continuing to speak Greek, continuing to pray in the Orthodox churches that the Ottomans permitted them to maintain, continuing to pass the liturgy and the language and the memory to their children. They are still there, or their descendants are, a small community in Istanbul maintaining a cultural continuity that stretches back, without complete interruption, to the Byzantine city and beyond it to the Greek city of Byzantium. The story is still going on. That is the extraordinary thing. The story is still going on. At some point in the night, if you are falling asleep, you may find that Constantinople and your own life begin to blur at the edges, as they do in that half-waking state, where everything becomes a kind of story, and the stories become a kind of dream. This is appropriate. History and dream share a quality that is hard to name, the quality of events that happened and cannot be undone, that are present in the world as weight and shadow, that shape the space you move through, even when you cannot see them directly. The city, on its 7 hills, shapes the space around it still. The geography that Constantine chose, and Byzas chose before him, is the geography of one of the great cities of the 21st century. The water that protected it is the water that makes it beautiful. The dome that Justinian built still floats in its ring of windows. The walls that Theodosius raised still stand in sections, still running from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. Their towers ruined and their gates blocked, but their lines still visible in the landscape. Walk in Istanbul today, and you are walking on Constantinople. The streets do not follow the old grid exactly, because the city has been rebuilt too many times, but the hills are in the same places, and the water is in the same places, and the general topography of a city organized around a great church, on a hill, near a palace, near a hippodrome, is still legible in the urban form. History is like this. It does not disappear. It accumulates. It goes underground and becomes geology. It becomes the shape of the land, and the direction of the streets, and the angle at which the light falls through windows placed by people who have been dead for 1,000 years. You are sleeping now, or nearly sleeping, and the city is sleeping under you in layers. Byzantium, under Constantinople, under Istanbul, under the present, each layer dreaming its own dreams, each layer present in the weight of the stone above and around and below. The water moves through the strait. The dome floats in its ring of light. The bells rang this morning, and they will ring tomorrow, though they are different bells now, and their language is different. The city is still there. It is always there. There is one more thing I want to tell you before the silence takes over completely. In the last years before the fall, as the Ottoman forces tightened their grip and the city knew what was coming, the people of Constantinople continued to hold their festivals. The calendar of feast days that had organized Byzantine life for over 1,000 years continued to turn. The churches continued to be decorated with flowers on the days that called for it. The liturgy continued to be sung. The markets continued to open in the morning. There is something deeply human about this, the way people in the shadow of catastrophe continue to do the ordinary things. The baker bakes. The fisherman goes out before dawn. The mother braids her daughter's hair. The student copies out his lessons. The monk kneels for the night office, not because they do not know what is coming, but because the ordinary things are the fabric of life itself, and to stop doing them is to have already lost. Constantinople went on being itself until the very last moment. That is not defeat. That is a kind of victory that has nothing to do with armies or walls or chains across harbours. The city was itself until the end, and then it became something else, and it is still here. The waters of the Bosphorus are dark now, and the city on its hills is lit by 1,000,000 lights, and somewhere in a neighbourhood whose name has changed 3 times in 2,000 years, someone is sleeping with the sound of the water coming through an open window, and the history of the place they are sleeping in is pressing up through the stone of the floor and the ancient earth beneath it. All that accumulated weight of living and dying and building and burning and beginning again. Let it press up through you too. Let all of that long, complicated, extraordinary story settle into your body like warmth. Let the emperors and the monks and the bakers and the scholars and the soldiers take their places in the long procession of people who have called this place home, and let the procession move slowly through the back of your mind and out the other side into the peaceful dark, where no story needs to be told and no history needs to be remembered, and everything is simply quiet. You are here. The city is there. The night holds both of you. Rest now. Rest now. Good night. And if you wake in the night, which sometimes happens, when the small worries of the day find you again in the dark, just remember that somewhere on the other side of the world, on a narrow headland where 2 seas meet and 2 continents press close to each other, a great dome is floating in a ring of light that has not stopped floating for nearly 15 centuries, and the water is moving through the strait as it has always moved, and the city is breathing in the way that very old cities breathe, deeply and slowly, and without needing to rush, because they have already been through everything that a city can go through, and they are still there. Still there. The dome floats, the water moves. The city breathes, and so do you. Good night. Let the stone hold the weight of the story. Let the water hold the reflection of the sky. Let the night hold the city, and let the city hold you, gently, in the way that old things hold us when we finally stop moving and let them. The world is deep and mostly kind in the quiet hours. The history is long, the rest is yours.